Often on this program, in fact, almost every episode, we talk about risk, the risk of data loss, the risk of financial loss, the risk of reputation damage. But what about legal risk? What kind of potential legal consequences do businesses face from cybersecurity breaches? And more importantly, how can they protect themselves? The liability factor on this episode of No Password Required.
Welcome to No Password Required, a monthly conversation that gives you an up-close and personal look at the world of cybersecurity.
Hello, I'm Bill McQueen, along with Ernie Ferraresso, and this is No Password Required. Our guest today is Jack Clabby. Jack is an attorney with Carlton Fields in Tampa, Florida. One of his areas of expertise is cybersecurity. He's a Princeton grad with a law degree from Penn, and he's a former assistant U.S. attorney in New Jersey. Jack, welcome to No Password Required.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill. Really looking forward to talking about cybersecurity and privacy with you guys today.
You are described or refer to yourself sometimes as a breach coach. Explain what that is.
So a breach coach is a professional who comes in who's not part of the organization, who helps quarterback, doesn't make the decisions, but helps quarterback the response to a data loss incident. So an example is if a retail company that accepts credit cards learns that its credit cards are out in the open, that there was some form of hack that exposed the credit cards of its customers. Now, they may have a suspicion as to how it happened, but they'll call us in. The investigation then will be under the attorney-client privilege. And because I've done a number of these, we help organize the response that comes from the retail organization. They might hire outside forensic computer experts. They might make a claim with their insurance company. They might prepare public statements to help tell the customers what happened and give them information. And I'm just there as someone who's done it a bunch before to help walk them through it so that they can avoid the missteps that other companies have made.
Are there other reasons why it's important to bring in someone from outside the organization?
So one of the things we see, and it really depends on who brings us in. So sometimes a breach coach is brought in by the general counsel's office because they're concerned that the information security experts have a conflict of interest because they may have been responsible for the lapse of security. Sometimes we get pulled in by the information security experts because they think that the in-house legal folks are not seeing the risk the way they should. And so part of what we do is we get the sort of IT and information security professionals to play nicely with the lawyers and vice versa. One of the recurring themes that we see with companies we work with, both before a breach incident, during a breach incident, and after a breach incident, is that not all the players who come to the table even know one another's names. At a big company, you might have a legal department with dozens of lawyers, but they've never actually met the information security team or the system securities teams. So one of the tips we give to companies who are thinking about or preparing about or looking at their potential responses to an incident, right now, before there's a crisis, the legal department, the customer service department, and the information security or the IT department should sit down and get to know one another. And depending on the culture, that can be a coffee, that could be a lunch, or we've had some success with moderated happy hours as well.
That's got to be one of those things that's a recurring theme that we've heard, time and time again. The old adage, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it seems that just a little bit of, getting to know your coworker and building those relationships inside your organization so that you know who to talk to when something goes sideways. That seems like that pays a lot of dividends. And a simple way to do it is, just hey, go down the hall and knock on their door and say, "Hi, I'm from."
I'll give you an example of how that can save companies money as well, right? Not just you think about what it costs to respond to a data breach versus what it costs to prepare the sort of personnel and documents to prevent a data breach, and the numbers are off by orders of magnitude, right? So if you can do a little bit of investment now, and think about literally what the price of a happy hour is to get these people to know each other, you can sometimes improve outcomes. One thing to mention here too is part of the planning that companies should go through is evaluating cyber insurance needs. Now, probably our listeners, if they're involved in risk at their organization, know a bit about cyber insurance, but there are resources that your insurance broker or your carrier will give you as part of what you're paying them for the cyber insurance. It's not free because you're sort of paying for it, but it's low cost or no cost. And the reason they do it is because it's their pocketbook on the line if there's a breach incident. And so there's an investment on the part of smart money, right, the insurance company money, to make sure that the insureds are preparing now for breaches because, again, an ounce of prevention, right, is worth a pound of cure. Which leads us to sort of another point, which is if an incident happens, address it. There's this, we've encountered in a number of examples, and I'll give you one without naming the company, but there's a tech company on the West Coast that had that learned of a breach incident. And the way they learned of it was a quote unquote cybersecurity expert called them up and said, "I see some of your data out on the dark web. If you pay me a quote unquote consulting fee, moderately priced, I will consult with you, and the entire nature of my consulting will be to not disclose to the public or the press that that this information is out there." And so a company who faces that is faced with a choice. They can do a sort of payment and hope that this goes away, or they can treat this like what it really is, which is a breach. In this example I'm giving, the company chose to make the payment and kept that decision-making very insular, didn't involve legal, kept it solely within the information security team. As a result of it, about a year later, there was another incident that was instantly public. And the folks who were responding to that, some of them knew about the old incident, some of them didn't know about the old incident. But the government found out about the old incident, and it would have been a lot better off, had this company simply dealt in a straightforward way with the original data loss. It's not what you did, right? Once you know you did something wrong, it's not what you did, it's what you do after what you did that often gets companies in trouble.
When a company has been breached, one of your clients, they bring you in, what's the first thing you have them do?
Right. So we have three steps, right? And the acronym we sometimes use is PIN, P-I-N. Preserve, investigate, notify. And you try to do them in that order, right? So step one is do no harm, right? Make sure that whatever the status of the system is today, hold it, right? Because we're going to need this evidence to find out what happened. And if there's later litigation or regulatory inquiry, we need to hold it where it is.
Or a criminal investigation.
Exactly. That's right. And not so much that the company was criminal, but the third party who actually committed the crime, if there is one. So preserve, then investigate. The second step is to figure out what happened. Is this active? Is this ongoing? What is the extent of it? What data has been exposed? When you have a handle on the investigation, then you can turn to the notification requirements. And that may be notifying consumers if their data was affected, notifying regulators or the Attorney General's office if you're required to do so under state law, notifying your contract counterparties, right? Let's say you're a financial services company who's holding, the payroll information or the life insurance information for another company's clients. You, under contract, will have to tell them. So preserve, investigate, and notify. And, at each of those stages, and it's obviously the model we use when we're responding is a lot more complicated than that, but that's probably the sort of easiest piece of it. But for the listeners who are involved in the legal side of things, right, they spend a lot more time on the preserve portion and the notification portion. But if you're a forensic specialist or you're in information security, you may be focused very much so on investigation and secondarily on preservation. But seeing the whole picture, regardless of where you are in the response apparatus, helps you understand, okay, the marketing team is asking me, one of the IT systems analysts, to give them information on what sort of personal information is affected. I may not care about that in the immediate sense because as the investigator, I'm just trying to figure out, is the breach ongoing? Are the bad guys out? But I need to realize for our company to continue to function, I have to take time to give answers to the marketing professional.
How important is it to have a first response team in place, ready to go with established protocols to deal with a breach?
Yeah, I think there are different sort of third-party studies that look at this, but most of them conclude that the savings between having an incident response guide and not having an incident response guide for large breaches are potentially seven figures plus. Right? We met with a client very recent, actually earlier this week, who had a third-party audit done, who had brought in a cybersecurity professional, not a lawyer, just a cybersecurity professional. Well, I probably shouldn't say just. I would say a cybersecurity professional as opposed to being simply a lawyer, right? Because
simply,
but it's their expertise, right?
Yeah.
We can't do that. So they bring in somebody whose job it is to test systems and test processes, and they found a couple of findings. But overall, this was a very mature entity for actually, not being breached. They had pretty good security controls. They had pretty good training, physical controls, but they didn't have a written incident response guide. So all the pieces they had that would make them less likely to have a breach, they didn't have that secondary level, which was a guide. What do we mean when we talk about an incident response guide? Well, usually it has a couple of components. First, it has sort of step-by-step procedures, meaning how are the potential data security incidents going to come in? Are they going to be calls to the helpline? Are they going to be reports to a superior? Should we have an anonymous line? When they're received, who does the initial triage? What's the plan for escalating those things? And are there certain times when we call in the C-suite or the board, for example? Are there certain times where, because we're a regulated industry, there are 48 or 72-hour triggers to respond? And then, so that's the first procedural part. But the part that most companies miss is the two attachments. And we talk about these two documents as being sort of the most important. The first is, your procedures won't describe individual names. Instead, it'll say the head of information security is in charge of this. It'll say the CFO is in charge of this. It will say the head of marketing is in charge of this. But attachment A should describe who the actual human beings are who are currently filling those roles and what their phone numbers are at all the places they can be reached. And if they can't be reached, a backup who is authorized to act for them and how to reach those people. And then the second attachment is the vendors. It is, what is the number of our insurance broker? What is the number of our insurance carrier? Who are the forensic firms that we like, that we've talked to already? Who are the lawyers who we're going to call? And then a good company should actually call those people and tell them, hey, you're on my incident response list.
Yeah.
So that, I'm happy to get calls in the middle of the night, but it does help if I know who you are.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. And how often do you find that, so in addition to just having that plan, practicing it, or at least doing a tabletop.
And keeping it updated.
I mean, that seems to be the, another key component of it. How many times does somebody walk by the fire extinguisher and, hey, we break the glass. What do we do now?
That's exactly right. It's, school children have fire drills.
Yeah.
Right? Organizations that hold complex data should test, should update, and should have an owner of the document. Sort of one thing we think about when we look at these incident response guides is I'll ask, okay, this looks pretty good. Who owns this? When was the last time it was updated? We often see in organizations they're willing to name a chief information security officer or someone with that equivalent title, but they're not willing to give her the authority.
Yeah.
So they give her accountability, but they don't give her authority.
No authority. Yep.
Or the opposite, right? They might give you accountability. If they might give you authority, you're in charge, but if something goes wrong, there's no way of sort of dealing with it, right? So it's got to be together, and I think having single person ownership of that document helps. Typically, it should be in the legal department so that there's somebody eyeballing it, but we've also seen it successfully taken for smaller organizations who don't have a legal department, allowing someone who's not the CEO but has whole firm view, like a CFO, for example, to own it. And another point you made, Ernie, which is a really good one, which is when we test cyber resilience, at least from a legal standpoint, as opposed to from a technical standpoint, one of the ways that companies have been able to win early on lawsuits after data breaches is by saying, we met the standard of care. Mm-hmm. And that's a legal term, and no one quite knows yet what it means in the data breach context. But one of the ways we have answered these sort of issues when we are defending a company who's being sued is we talk about pulling together the binder. What is the binder, right? The binder is the incident response guide. It might be the policies and procedures over data retention and governance. It might be the privacy policy if there's an allegation that the company wasn't accurately describing its data protection protocols or its data use protocols. And then it would also have a record of the training that was done. It would have a record of the audit committee or the board meetings where there were updates on cybersecurity. And you can typically pull that together in 100 documents or less. It's really just this is what it is, so that if I sit down with a regulator or with a plaintiff's attorney on behalf of a class of consumers, I can show them the binder, which is, look, something went wrong here. There clearly was a breach. The question is whether the company that suffered the breach alongside the consumers is going to be held responsible for it. And I think there's a good argument here based on their good faith sort of efforts, and I can pass the binder across the table, which is why, to go back to what I said before, when companies are confronted with breach events, they have to resist that urge to sort of suppress them or to resolve them quietly, because if that binder includes, if I push the binder across, but then a plaintiff's attorney or the regulator pushes across hey, we've got a cooperating witness who said you knew about a breach a year ago, didn't close the gap, didn't announce it, and here you are telling me.
You're telling us you're all clean and
then the settlement value of the case is impacted, and the ability for the company to get out of it is impaired. Now, it doesn't mean you can't come back, because, think about an organization, right? If you have 100,000 employees, or if you have 10,000 employees and 3 people knew about something and suppressed it, it doesn't make sense to hold the entire company accountable, but it's just not a good fact.
Yeah. It doesn't help the case at all.
So it's a culture of compliance is a big part of these organizations. And, organizations like Cyber Florida help with that, because it lets us talk about mistakes that get made without saying that folks need to be responsible for them. We all, companies are consistently attacked, and they successfully repel 98% of those attacks. But when we talk about those 98%, I think we should continue the dialogue to talk about the 2% as well, because bad actors are out there and they're sophisticated, and they get in despite your very best opportunities to be helpful.
Are you seeing, you were talking about being attacked. But when we were talking on the phone before the show, you mentioned that we're seeing more of what you refer to as inside jobs. Yeah. Give me an example of that.
No, so that's a very good point. So there are external attacks, there are internal attacks, and then there's mistakes, right? And if we think about 3 buckets, depending on your industry, you may be far more susceptible to inside jobs. And so let's think about probably one of the more common examples we see. We call the CTO who hedged his bets. We have little names for all these different hacks. We've got the divorced nurse. We've got a few other ones. But these are all come from multiple real stories. And so the call we might get in a case like this is, they'll call and they'll say, Jack, we have, and it might be the general counsel's office calling and saying, one of our IT systems analysts observed some unusual behavior from one of our corporate executives. The corporate executive was passed over for a promotion, or the compensation decisions came out, and he or she was upset with the comp decisions. And the other day, we saw some log-on activity really early in the morning, and quite a bit of data being passed through their VPN. And it looks like the data that's being sucked out is a trade secret or something that would be of value to a competitor. Help. And so in that scenario, it's an insider who's taking not personal information, right? So not consumer disclosable information, but taking customer lists, taking ideas for a new application for a software company, taking pricing information for a consumer services or services organization, stuff that's actually on the market much more valuable than a list of Social Security numbers. And so the way those engagements tend to work is we will work with the collaborative and cooperative sort of internal folks and quietly bring in a forensic firm, harden a shell around the bad guy. We won't stop the internal actor because we don't want to let him or her know we're there. Harden a shell, and then separate them from the organization and try to preserve as much evidence of the wrongdoing. That's tough because you have to move quickly, right? Because the whole value of these trade secrets is that nobody else has it. And you can do these quietly. These are not the sort of things that necessarily need to get reported. There's no legal obligation in many cases to do so. So if you can handle it with deftness, it's a possibility that everybody can walk away from this. The company having its integrity protected as best it can, and the person who acted badly, not necessarily facing anything other than separation from the company, maybe a loss of severance.
From a liability standpoint, does it matter whether it's an external attack, an internal attack? If the victim, the company, is going to end up in court, who attacked them, why they attacked them, how they attacked them, does that matter?
Yeah, so almost the worse the bad guy, the better it is. And it's sort of an odd thing, right? So if the bad guy is an ascertainable insider who takes personal information, that leads to identity theft. So the divorce nurse is a good example, right? Because the divorce nurse is somebody who, in the organization, is looking up her ex-husband and is violating his HIPAA rights, his sort of federal rights to his rights to data integrity within his healthcare records. There are other claims that a potential plaintiff can bring in a case like that, including negligent hiring and negligent supervision, subject to legal defenses, of course. But if it's a bad guy who just hacks in from a foreign country, a little more anonymous, there's less responsibility often for the company in those scenarios. So the insider threats tend to have very high dollar losses associated with them because what they're taking is really, really important to the company.
Yeah.
If it happens to also be PII, there are additional claims that a plaintiff could bring. And so I think when companies are thinking it through, there's three buckets, right? It's outside actors who are attacking your system, insiders who know and have permission to go everywhere in the system, not being supervised properly, and then third, sort of the accidents, right? And the accidents can happen in a variety of ways. The most common, of course, is we call it the laptop shuffle. Okay, so the laptop shuffle is if you don't have TSA PreCheck and you're going through, you have your laptop with you and you're going through security. You'll have your laptop on its own in one of those bins checking through security. You'll have your other stuff and your vitamin water or whatever you might have, and your other kind of your car keys and whatnot. And as you're being rushed to make your flight, you put the two bins together and you forget that your laptop was in the bin and you just leave it at TSA. Now, what are the odds that a laptop that's at TSA that might contain PII ever would lead to a data breach? Pretty low.
Pretty low, yeah.
TSA is going to take it. It'll go into a room like at the end of Indiana Jones and just sit there forever. You may even be able to recover it. But under certain state laws, the exposure of that data would lead to a claim, right? And potentially you have to notice all the people who are on that, whose PII was on that. We have had cases where that has happened. We have also had cases where thumb drives, unencrypted thumb drives, get lost. We had a case where, literally to try to be safe, the general counsel's office had printed a secure, sort of a list of personal information that had to be delivered to a regulator onto a thumb drive. And during the walk to the regulator's office, it was lost. And so these things happen. So the easiest fix to these is to encrypt all data when it's at rest. So like if you have a laptop, just install an encryption on that laptop. So if you lose it at the airport, you don't have to do anything with it. If you allow your employees to hold these thumb drives and put PI on the thumb drives, some companies just don't allow it. But if you allow it, give them, for 50 cents, access to an encryption program. Now it's included in some versions of Windows, so you can go ahead and just encrypt it. So all these losses, the sort of accidental losses, are frustrating because they are preventable with the right sort of cyber hygiene. Some of the sophisticated overseas actors just literally aren't preventable. They're not.
It's funny you mentioned. We talked about it. You mentioned overseas nation-state type of actors, and I started thinking about. We were talking about insurance, and it brought to my mind the latest one. I believe it's with Maersk, and their insurance carrier is telling them they weren't going to cover them. Their cyber insurance carrier wasn't going to cover them because it was a nation-state. It was an act of war. I'd be interested to hear. I mean, because that was a pretty significant cyber incident across the globe, and I'm sure that impacted a lot of people. And it sounds like, oh well, because it was the Russians. I'm sorry, we can't cover you.
Well, by the way, mentioning the Russians on a podcast really helps your visibility on it, because then it's gonna pop up. That's the stock and trade of the nation state, right? So if you think about some of the hacks that have happened that have been over the years that literally are there not to take, but are there to destroy and to disrupt. I mean, that's the stock and trade right of the nation state actor. And so I won't comment specifically on any particular coverage issues that are going on, but I will say this. If you're a company that has cyber insurance, probably 8 out of 10 engagements that I participate in are covered by cyber insurance. We are paid directly without the client having to be paid, and it responds immediately. And so most of the time it works, and it works really well, particularly for what they call first-party response, which is we have a hack or we have a ransomware incident. We don't know what's going on. Okay, here's $100,000. You can use this to hire a forensic firm, and you can use this to hire a law firm because we know that spending that will save you millions down the road. All right. But for the larger and catastrophic cases, when they are covered and when they are not covered, often, at least in my experience, turns on the level of communication from the insured to the insurance carrier and how early it occurred. Right. So it's got to be communication from the insured to the insurance carrier, and it's got to happen early. Some of the more public cases where there's been disputes between carriers and their insureds over coverage for a cyber event, you read the fact pattern, and it's essentially this horrible thing happened. Maybe they told the insurance company, but then they were silent for months. And then they present the insurance company with a bill for $20 million. Yeah. And the insurance company's like, wait a minute. This may have all been reasonable, but you needed to have told me in week 2 or in week 3 or in week 4. I need to see the engagement letters. I need to see, was there a competitive bid for these things? And so it's not no insurance product is perfect, but I will say that there are techniques you can use in communicating with insurance carriers that will improve your likelihood of getting paid.
Yeah, I think that's, there's kind of a theme that you're touching on here is as soon as you learn about something happening, it's engage early and often. Yeah. It's just like voting, right? Early and often.
That's right.
It's plug in with that because that's going to set you up for success later on down the line, whether it's with the insurance aspect of it, whether it's with the compliance, the regulators, and then even for things out into the future. You're able to say, look, we took the right steps, we did the right things. We're trying to do the right thing. So I think that pays dividends.
One more question before we go to break. You encourage companies to treat data breaches the same way they would treat a product recall. What do you mean by that?
Right. So there's, data breaches. Data breaches have been. I probably did my first data breach 15 years ago, right? But that was sort of at the outset. There really were not state AG rules for how to handle these things. And so when you try to tell a company that has never been through one before how to do it, the analogy of the product recall is a good one, right? You might have let's say you make cars. You have a problem with 1 or 2 cars. Okay, it's a small problem. We're going to deal with it regionally. You have a problem with 100 cars or 200 cars. We're going to elevate this to the senior vice president level. You have a problem with 1 million cars. You've got to elevate this to the board, and we need to have a talk about this. And the talk has to happen in a compressed time frame because now that we know the extent of the problem, if we don't get ahead of it, the liability, the public relations aspects of it, the insurance aspects of it, all are going to become disastrous. And so the themes of escalation of a known problem, I think for cybersecurity breaches are quite similar to what you might look at if you're in a products liability issue, both from your reputation standpoint, from the liability standpoint, and from the internal escalation standpoint.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, and Bill, you probably remember, was it the cyanide in the Tylenol? And using Tylenol as the way they approached their response to that is like a case study. And so it's interesting you mentioned that because I don't think a lot of people think of their cyber incidents in this, the automotive liability. Oh, I got to do a recall and how that impacts it. But also in the future, that goes back to showing that, hey, listen, we're a decent company. We're trying to do the right thing here. We're trying to look out for, the public's best interest. So that's really interesting.
We've been talking about what a company should do when there is a breach, but what about a company that has not been hacked but wants to be in a position to protect itself and protect its customers? We'll take a look at that issue when No Password Required continues.
Have an idea for a guest or topic? Send an email to info@nopasswordpodcast.com.
With Ernie Ferraresso, I'm Bill McQueen, and this is No Password Required. Our guest today is attorney Jack Clabby. Jack, let's talk about a situation where a company wants to protect itself. It's not been hacked, but it wants to have the proper protocols in order. They approach you, they bring you in. What's the first thing you do?
I say, I need to see a couple of documents and I need to meet a couple of people, right? So typically what I want to see is, do you have an incident response guide? Do you have this written playbook for what will happen for a breach? I'll also say, do you have a privacy policy? It can be on your website. It can be a paper privacy policy. But what are you telling the individuals who interact with your company about how you are collecting and how you're using their data? If I can look at an incident response guide and a privacy policy, I can usually get a pretty good sense of what's going on at that company for data security. And then the people I want to meet are, who's the person who's in charge of your system security? And just asking that open-ended question can give a shockingly varietous number of answers.
Well, it depends.
Yeah, exactly. Is it morning or is it night? That's my test for accountability. And if it's somebody who is sort of a 22-year-old kid, he might be very skilled, but I know he doesn't have the authority.
Yeah.
And he certainly doesn't have he might be accountable in the sense if something goes wrong, they'll get rid of him.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's at the outset, I want to see some documents and I want to meet some people. And then what we might recommend for next steps, right? The biggest piece of it is something we'll call data mapping. All right. So what data mapping is it can be done by an outside vendor. It can be done internally at a company, but it's each piece of personal information or sensitive information that a company gets. Where does it go within the organization? Who gets, if it's a retail organization and they accept a credit card for payment, have they outsourced that to a third party so that credit card number never hits their systems? Or does it come onto their systems and stay forever? Are they making a profile of the consumer, adding it in from other information they have on her so they can send her coupons in the mail? That data mapping process helps you figure out, okay, what are they holding? And then from what they're holding, where's the greatest risk? The one mistake that companies make when they're doing this process is they try to protect everything and they don't deploy resources carefully, right? You don't need to spend, if you have names and addresses that are publicly available, you don't need to spend the same amount of money on those as you do protecting your employee W-2s or tax records, right? You treat those differently. In the same way that your head of IT is going to have better access to the systems than the person who answers the customer help desk. You have to have varying levels of authority. And so again, I'll ask for those pieces of paper. I'll ask to meet those people, and then I'll talk a bit about data mapping. Now, when you get into sort of the more complex pieces, we often talk about getting a cybersecurity assessment. There's different terms for that. At its base, an assessment is bringing in a third party or doing it internally with some guides that are out there, some helpful guides, and auditing your own company as to, one, is it protected from external threats? Two, if it were to have a penetration, how would it respond to it? And then third, are there non-cybersecurity aspects, physical security aspects that would be a problem for this company too? So again, that's at the lower end. At the higher end, you get into something like assurance, right? So if assessment's at the lower end of this third-party review, assurance is at the higher end, where the company's picking a standard, and then it's getting essentially audited to that standard. And that would need to be done by an independent third party. And that can be, ISO or NIST. There's a federal standard for federal contractors called FedRAMP. There are special assessors for companies that touch credit card data, PCI. And there's QSAs, or the people who can come in and tell you, and give you a certificate. And when you're thinking about that spectrum, if you're a company that doesn't hold much personal information, you may want to do an assessment every other year. If you're a bank, you will need to do an assessment.
Whether you like it or not.
Every year. And if you're in New York, for example, you'll need to do it in a written form on an annual basis. Right, so different states and different regulators have different requirements, but that's probably the sort of bucket of it. And you can do it, again, at a kick the tires low end, or you can do it as a thorough end, where at the end of it you get a certificate from this third party that you can then show to folks who want to do business with you and say, look, well, for example, my law firm, right? So Carlton Fields is ISO 27001 certified. Mm-hmm. It was an expense that we did, but we did it at every one of our offices, and we're one of the few law firms who did it. We did it because we were holding sensitive data for a lot of big clients, and they wanted to audit us every year. And that's understandable. But by doing this audit and getting this piece of paper and staying compliant with ISO 27001, we spent money, but we decreased the amount of time and money we were spending on these outside client audits. And we thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But again, it's not going to be a fit for every company. If you're a law firm that has 5 people and you only do real estate closings, you have security risks, but you're not going to go through the expense of getting the 27001.
A little bit earlier, we talked about cyber insurance. Briefly, what should a company look for and be aware of, be leery of perhaps, when it comes to purchasing cybersecurity insurance?
Yeah, so the most important factor is the quality of the insurance broker that you're working with, right? That's it. And so ask your insurance broker, what is your experience with cybersecurity? What's your experience with cybersecurity coverage? And if they don't have a good answer for you, it doesn't mean you need to get rid of your broker, but ask your broker to go back to his brokerage and find the person who is. Most of them have product specialists. They have somebody who knows what they're doing. And this is true both for small businesses that work with local brokers and the largest organizations that work with the largest brokers. Your broker probably knows your business but may not know cyber. Right? So far and away, that's the most important piece. The second piece is if you've done your data mapping, you know what your risk is. Okay, so if you're a manufacturing facility and you're selling only to other businesses, you don't need a ton of third-party coverage, or you don't need a ton of coverage for individual consumers suing you because you don't have any personal information. What you do need is business interruption coverage, BI coverage, right? Because if there's a hack on your plant floor and one of the robot arms goes down, you're not going to be able to fulfill orders. You're not going to,
your logistics.
Pay your employees.
Yeah, your data. Yeah, exactly. Your database that owns all your inventory is seized and held for ransom. Yeah, how do you going to?
That's it.
Yep.
What happens? We brokers are the experts in insurance coverage, but I will tell you that we get calls from board members at clients who will say things like, I was at a conference. That's how they talk. I was at a conference.
They're always at a conference.
That's right. It's one of the benefits of being a board member.
That's right.
They also sit in that front part of the plane that I always walk by.
The big seats.
I've seen those. Yeah. I've heard of these big seats.
So they'll say, I heard we're supposed to get cyber insurance. Let's get some cyber insurance.
Put some cyber on that.
And what happens when a board member says that to a company? They run out. And, it's like if my wife asked me to get flowers, I will go and I will purchase flowers. I will not purchase the one she wanted. I will just get the flowers, right? And so
lovely hydrangeas.
That's
very nice.
That's the problem with cyber insurance is that it's often reactive. But when it's time to annually re-up, it's good to have a sober conversation about it and to ask questions. If your IT or your information security personnel inform the executives at the company that they are getting a lot of overseas hits, they should have a conversation about exclusions for acts of war, have a conversation for exclusions for foreign state actors. Ransomware and social engineering fraud is something that's often written out of cyber insurance policies. And so one of the questions you want to ask is, do I need a social engineering rider? And again, you pay a little more for it, but if that's what your risk is.
Yeah, exactly. That's the attack vector, then.
Don't get the cyber insurance unless you're going to get the good one.
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of like, it's like in my life, I've probably bought 100 kites for my kids, but I always get the cheapest kite, and the kite's invariably what? What happens to them?
They're either snapped or they're in the tree.
Right,
they
break. They break.
Up on the roof.
Up on the roof, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if having a kite was important to me, I would probably invest in a better kite. But for what it's worth is don't buy a product unless, one, you know how it works, and two, it's what you're trying to do.
So you're saying you don't know a lot about kites?
Maybe the better is if you have 4 kids, don't buy a sedan, right? Go with the minivan.
Go with the minivan. Just cut to the chase.
It doesn't make any sense, right? Because you're gonna have to take 2 trips to get those kids to school
and pick up those kites.
That's right.
We're going to look at some of the areas where cyber liability is changing when No Password Required continues.
You are listening to the No Password Required podcast. We cover cybersecurity and a lot of other stuff.
We're back. This is No Password Required. I'm Bill McQueen with Ernie Ferraresso, and our guest today, Attorney Jack Clabby. California is a leader in cybersecurity policy education. Why have they come to the forefront?
Yeah, so I mean, it's what is it, the 9th largest economy if it were its own country
in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And they have a tradition, and it's a point of pride for them for being consumer friendly, right? So there's been a lot of conversations recently about whether California can set car emission standards that are more intense than the federal standards. So the federal standards will set a floor, and then California will set a ceiling. But if you're Subaru or you're Toyota and you're making cars, you've got to meet that California standard.
Or you just don't sell to California.
That's right. So what California has done is it has adopted something called the California Consumer Privacy Act, and it is a watershed privacy act. And what it has done, it has taken the prior model of state data breach and data privacy was, in the event, the statute would say, in the event of a breach of personal information defined this way and breach defined this way, you shall make notice within a reasonable amount of time to the affected individuals. All right. Maybe it would also say a company has to have reasonable security measures. That might be the most it says. But it wouldn't say anything about privacy, wouldn't say anything about privacy policies. It would not allow individuals to sue. It would just be silent on it, or it would allow the Attorney General to sue. So what California has done is change that. They've given a specific concrete set of privacy rights to California residents, and they've done it in a way that requires companies to tell the consumers at or before the point of collection of that personal information why it's being collected, what it's being done, and how a consumer can request, one, to delete that information, or two, so that the company, if it were reselling the information, would not resell the information. There's a lot more to it, but the biggest change is it takes it from a reactive, what do you do in response to a data breach, to a proactive, by giving rights to California residents as to what they can demand companies do or don't do with their data.
We're running out of time, but I want to ask a couple of more questions. California's aggressive actions, pro-consumer actions, how is that affecting other states?
So for larger companies that do business in California, they have to comply with the California rule. And so
the emission standard thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's the emission standard. So there are a lot of Florida-based business folks who are listening here and will serve those companies who have had to change their privacy policy. If you go on, any relatively large company's website now and click on privacy, there may be a do not sell button. California bought that real estate. There may be a special California privacy notice. The California legislature bought that real estate. And other states are passing reactive legislation that either mimics California or, as a way of blocking California or not going as far as California, passing something less. And one of the standards that actually is being proposed here in Florida is something called the Nevada model, which is a very different version. Actually, its effective date predated California, but it really the Nevada model, which Florida may or may not adopt, but is in front of it, focuses on barring companies that are operators of online services. Right? So a company that runs a website that touches Florida, requiring them to have opt-out options from the sale of personal data. So it really, again, it looks like California in that it requires a privacy policy, but it really focuses on the sale of information. And for most companies, that's something that, while it'll be expensive for them to deal with, is not quite as far as California's gone.
For our final question, we're introducing a new segment on No Password Required. We're calling it Ernie's Personality Test.
Yes.
He's got 5 questions. Okay. What are we going to do here? We're
All
just
right.
going to, you ask the question, single word response?
Okay, yes. So I have a series of questions here for you, Jack. Carefully selected for you. And it's an either or. You pick one of these two, and we'll go from there.
All right.
So
he is an attorney. Should we get him to sign a release for this?
I think he did. It was in a consent form.
Oh,
when he came
okay.
in. Whether it's a blanket waiver, but of course, he laughs because he knows blanket waivers aren't worth it. The paper they're printing.
Fire away.
That's right. So here we go. Predator or Alf?
Oh, I've always been a Predator fan.
Okay, yeah, Dutch. Yeah, that's right. Next one. Black coffee or Starbucks concoction?
I switched to black coffee about 10 years ago, and I haven't looked back.
See, now it's looking more like Dutch. I'm expecting him to come walking in here with a cigar and a machine gun. Come on, get through the chopper. That was Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
In case you guys, never mind.
Not Jesse Ventura.
He ain't got time to bleed. Carl, what a great movie, though. I mean, it had some of the best in it. Carl Weathers,
The original Predator.
That's right.
That's right.
All right, here's a cyber-related one.
Okay.
AI or quantum computing?
I think AI. I think that quantum computing is fascinating, but AI is either going to kill us or make us all. I'm an AI alarmist.
Again, with the Arnold Schwarzenegger, we're seeing a theme here.
That's right.
The Terminator is coming to get us. Skynet.
I saw Terminator 2 in a hotel the other day, and of course you have to watch it to the end.
Well, you can't not.
You can't not.
Yeah.
Predator, I can come or go, but man, Terminator 2, that's a stop. Watch the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's the classic. All right, now we're going to get into some very weighty legal yes or no questions. You being an attorney. Matlock or Perry Mason?
I think Matlock for me. I think they're both criminal defense lawyers, but I think Matlock had a little bit of homespun quality.
You did like Matlock,
as
huh?
a Tampa lawyer, I feel like there's a little bit more of that
yeah.
in me.
Okay, that's interesting. Interesting. Okay, and now the final one: night court or the practice?
I'm all in on night court.
That's right, winner.
Yeah, that's the correct answer.
That is the correct answer.
I don't think
that is the correct answer.
I'm ready for a reboot of that.
Yes.
Of Night Court. He was a magician.
Exactly.
There's so much going on in that show.
I mean, I'd like to think that if you're in court at night, that you're going to get some magic tricks.
There is a debate in the legal community about whether prosecutors should be friends or not necessarily friends, but should have good relationships with public defenders.
Yeah.
And there's long studies on it because does it lead to defendants being railroaded or does it lead to better outcomes, more fair outcomes? And I believe in the latter. I think it leads to more fair outcomes. And having been a prosecutor,
so you were like John Larroquette.
I
mean, you had the height.
Let's leave it at that. I think we should, maybe not as, but I do think, but I do think
That's
Night Court
not necessarily a compliment.
but Night Court is the
remember the
example.
character.
But Night Court is the example that I give, which is justice happened in that court, and it happened because they knew they were going to see each other again, and so there weren't betrayals. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I thought the public defenders did a good job of representing their clients. Night Court. Two things. One, let's get it streaming because I don't know if it's streaming anywhere. If it is, if there's a listener here, get word to Ernie because I want to know.
I mean, heck,
streaming.
we can get some. I mean, there's some really lousy shows that are
get word to
now.
me. I'd like to know if it's streaming. And two, let's reboot that thing. I'm in on it.
If someone knows how to stream Night Court, or if they have a question about cybersecurity and legal ramifications, how can they contact you?
Please call me or email me. My phone number is 813-229-4229. It sounds like it's made up, but that's actually my direct dial. 813-229-4229.
It's better than call Jack.
Or email me at jclabby, JCLABBY, at carltonfields.com.
And if there's a topic you'd like to hear more about, if you have a comment, a question, please contact us at info@nopasswordpodcast.com. Our guest today has been Jack Clabby of the law firm Carlton Fields here in Tampa, Florida. Jack, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Ernie.
For Ernie Ferraresso, I'm Bill McQueen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the No Password Required podcast. The show is produced by Cyber Florida. A special thanks goes out to our friends at Carlton Fields and Cognizant. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, visit our website, cyberflorida.org/pod.